Good evening, everyone, and welcome to those of you in the room, and there's quite a good turnout, which is fantastic, and those of you watching behind the camera, wherever you may be. I'm Sian Collins, I'm the Head of Special Collections and Archives at University of Wales Trinity St David, which is one of the longest job titles I think I've ever had. And I'm very happy to welcome you tonight to the latest in our series of talks to celebrate the bicentenary of the university. Our speaker tonight is Professor Mary-Ann Constantine of the Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies. Following a degree in English literature and a PhD in Brechin's folklore, Mary-Ann held various research fellowships in Aberystwyth before joining the Centre in 2002. She has taught, researched and published extensively in the area of Welsh and Celtic studies, and she specialises in the history and literature of Wales and the Celtic-speaking countries from 1700 to 1900. She has led on a number of fascinating projects, one of which we're going to hear about this evening, so I won't give too much away. But I would say I've had a look at a couple of the websites, and there's a lot of really, really interesting stuff. So if you have an opportunity to have a look at the website for any of her projects afterwards, please do. And on top of the teaching, research and project work, Mary-Ann is the author of 2 collections of short stories and a novel. So I feel exhausted just thinking about that, to be honest. We are very, very excited and grateful that she can be here tonight, that she's found the time to talk to us about the discovery of, I suppose, the beauty and fascination of scenic places such as Snowdonia by people who were unable to travel outside of the UK due to adverse external circumstances. And of course, we're talking about the 18th century, but that could have been the last couple of years as well. So I think it's quite topical. And just finally for me, Mary-Ann has very kindly offered to answer some questions at the end. So for those of you who are teaming in, please put your question in chat. We will try to get through as many as possible, depending on time. And of course, those of you in the room will also be able to ask questions. So I will now disappear and leave you to our speaker this evening, Mary-Ann Constantine.
Diolch yn fawr, Sian. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr i chi gyd am ddod heno. Mae'n bleser gweld pobl go iawn yn yr ystafell hon. I'm very grateful to Ruth and to Nikki and to Sian for this invitation to talk about something very close to my heart. Very timely, I think, as Sian says. And also, it gave me a chance to actually hold and look at some very, very beautiful books last week when I came over. And I've based my talk around the selection of books in the exhibition. Some of them have been shoehorned in rather rapidly, and others get a lot more attention. But I think I've managed to name check everybody, so we'll see how we go. Well, the exhibition itself, which I strongly encourage you to look at online, does a wonderful job of providing a contextual historical narrative. It tells you the story of the shift in cultural perceptions of the mountains of North Wales from a grim, barren, unappealing landscape to a tourist attraction. It's a shift mirrored in other parts of the British Isles and across Europe. Imagine the lakes, the highlands and the Alps. The exhibition outlines the development of roads and accommodation, the necessary infrastructure for visitors, and it indicates how travel for leisure became more available to a wider demographic. It notes the highly influential publication in 3 volumes between 1778 and 1783 of the tours in Wales of Thomas Pennant, the Flintshire naturalist and antiquarian. And it shows how he and other authors, themselves to varying degrees, helped to create the conditions for picturesque tourism, inspiring people to visit particular sites and getting them enthused about the beauties which they could encounter a lot more cheaply and with less effort than by going on a tour of the continent. And as Sian has just said, for much of this period, the continent is not exactly closed due to the war with France, but it's certainly dangerous and difficult of access. So with the contextual sort of chassis already in place, thanks to the exhibition, I thought I'd talk to you today about the stuff under the bonnet, about the processes that lie behind these published tours. What's the relationship between these beautiful books as finished objects and the lives, places and circumstances which brought them into being? How do they relate to the actual travels of their authors? What do they tell us? and what do they not tell us? Now, tours are very often used by historians, but what kind of historical witness do they provide? Do they actually provide insights into Welsh culture at this period, or do they merely show us the preconceptions of the beholders? Very few tours have become literary classics, and yet some of them are beautifully written. What kind of literature is this? So for me, the appeal of this material has always been its curiously in-between nature, the unexpected light it can bring to all sorts of different areas. Specialists love tours, or at least bits of them that they tend to cherry pick out. You work on the history of slate quarries. Scores of people a year troop round Llanberis in the 1790s and the 1800s. Surely somebody will have jotted down a previously unnoticed detail about techniques or wages or transport. You want records of historical weather events? Well, meet this lady, dripping like a waterfall, struggling out of her travelling gear in the inn at Llanrwst, the year that the floods ripped up the bridge and swept down the Conwy Valley. This is why Michael Freeman's brilliant website is such a delight to anybody interested in the history of material culture in Wales. I recommend that anybody who's interested in this period have a good browse on that. And yet, if you want unreliable narrators, look no further. Who are the real voices here? Did they really see that waterfall, or have they nicked the description from somebody else? Have they, whisper it, actually been to Wales? By the turn of the century, the home tour is so fashionable, it was fair game for satire. In a play by the poet Charlotte Smith, one particularly foppish character remarks, "I'm on the circuit. I'm on a tour. I'm going to publish travels in North Wales, and I thought, though it isn't absolutely necessary, that I might just as well take a peep at the country before I gave an account of it." It's only when you get your hands messy and start to pull these texts apart, and not literally, I promise our librarians, that you realise just how complicated they can be. My own interest in tours of Wales came into focus during a project on the Welsh and Scottish tours of Thomas Pennant, which was funded between 2014 and 18 by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and ran in partnership with the University of Glasgow. We called it Curious Travellers, and it took on a life of its own, outliving its funding period, mainly because the project team just carried on being interested in the material and have all continued to research and publish in the area. And I'd like to raise a hand here to my colleagues at CAUX, to Ffion Jones, who edited hundreds of letters by Thomas Pennant and is currently writing a book in Welsh about his network of informants, and to Liz Edwards, who edited many unpublished tours of Wales and has just sent me a beautiful essay on the Welsh travels of the watercolourist and scientist Cornelius Varley. So my talk this evening is in 3 parts. I want to start by looking more closely at Pennant's tours as a text. Then I want to introduce you very briefly to some of the people behind these other books, Warner, Bingley, Pugh, the Williamses. And then I'd like to finish with some of the more hidden voices of the tour genre, mainly by women. Pennant wasn't the first writer of a tour in Wales by any means, but he was undoubtedly the most influential one, and his work is an excellent place to start the business of unpicking a tour text. So let's start with the idea of historical witness. In the first published edition of the opening volume, which came out in 1778, Pennant tells his readers, "These home travels are the first part of an account of my own country and were actually performed in the year mentioned in the title page." And that year was 1773, the year after he'd completed his second tour of Scotland. And at the time he was gaining a reputation as a writer of travels as well as a naturalist. Now, as Paul Evans and Ffion Jones have demonstrated from the correspondence, Pennant was indeed pretty busy then, riding around North Wales, visiting various gentry friends and acquaintances, exploring local landmarks. And what follows, I think, is interesting. The world, he writes, justly loves the reality. Therefore, this is mentioned to satisfy the public that they are not formed out of tours undertaken at different periods. Perish the thought. Well, that claim was quietly and sensibly dropped in the second edition. Pennant's anxiety about being a reliable witness I think stems from an earlier shift in travel writing, which was driven by narratives of scientific discovery and encouraged plain eyewitness accounts of travels and experiences. But Pennant, the Enlightenment naturalist, the careful observer and measurer of cromlechs and castle ruins, is also a historian, a teller of stories, a researcher and a social being, absorbing other people's ideas and recalling his own earlier experiences. And so his writing is actually layered and full of voices. We can see an example of that layering in his much cited description of Snowdon, which recollects very different ascents made under very different weather conditions some 20 years apart. So this account comes out in 1781, but in no sense is it a description of somebody experiencing Snowdon in 1781. It contrasts the recollection of ascent made in August 1752 with a more recent climb in the late summer of 1770. On the first occasion, the party climbed through the night under starry skies, which is amazing. They get up at midnight and climb, and they see the sunrise, gilding the sea and dispelling the mist like curtains lifting in a theatre, to reveal Anglesey, extended like a map beneath us with every rill visible, and views that reach to England, Scotland and Ireland. The account of the view from the later ascent is as dynamic and unpredictable as that first is static, with furiously circulating mist shifting the various scenes and exhibiting a most strange and perplexing sight of water, fields, rocks or chasms in 50 different places. They then closed at once and left us involved in darkness. Many people think this is an account of a single climb, and you have to read closely to realise what he's telling you is two different events. But perhaps because those two descriptions cover all eventualities, Pennant's account of the summit of Snowdon becomes one of the most influential sections of his tours. Throughout his work, we encounter then not just the experience of an observant land traveller in a landscape in the 1770s, but that traveller's recollections of himself in that landscape in former times. And there's a lovely moment of him remembering being a child, taking a peat sledge down an almost vertical slope in Dinas Malswy, and just terrified at what he can remember. And also braving the swellies in the Menai Strait in a little rowing boat. So taking you back in time as well. The tours, however, also contain many observations, much information and interesting experiences from other people. And here, there's a really lovely and rather haunting piece that Pennant writes about a wreck of birds along the coastline along from Criccieth. What we're actually hearing is in fact pretty well verbatim the voice of Hugh Davis, the naturalist from Anglesey. This is his experience given its place in Pennant's ride along the coast. And here we can see the letter edited by Fionn, which gives you the first few lines of that beautiful section of the tours in Wales. So something that you can read as straight literature, an evocative list of dead seabirds along a coastline, is actually information fed in from another source, more or less verbatim. Deeply interesting, and also terribly interesting to naturalists to know who was the observer and exactly when. Sorry, I'm back on. Elsewhere, even stranger, the experience of being in landscape is actually evoked through editorial acts of cutting and pasting. There's a really famous bit about Pennillion singing in the mountains of Dinas Malswy, where he's kind of riding along through the hills, and it's a bit like The Sound of Music. Everybody is singing Pennillion left, right and centre and trying to be the first in song, and it's all terribly Welsh and terribly cultural. And it didn't actually happen because it's a description given him by John Cloyd of Carwys, and it was supposed to go in a bit about the Eisteddfod at Flintshire. And Cloyd actually says, don't put it there, move it into a more musical region where it will fit better. But what Pennant actually does is frame it with travel description. These mountainous countries, I continue the ride as before between high mountains. And there you go, there's that little episode in the middle, which didn't actually happen, but it should have done. Considered then as types of historical witness, the Welsh and Scottish tours are rather different. Travelling in Scotland in 1769 and 1772, Pennant had a clear itinerary. He wasn't at home. He had his bags, he had his horses, and they did a circuit. You can have a lot of fun on our website tracing the different 3 tours that he did, of the 3 volumes, and matching them up against Johnson and Boswell's tour, which happened pretty well at the same time. And yet, the Scottish tours also prove interestingly unstable. And James Boswell was not wholly unfair in his scornful remark that Pennant could put together only curt, frittered fragments of his own, and afterwards procured supplemental intelligence from parochial ministers. Well, that is exactly what Pennant did. He sent out a list of queries ahead of his arrival, and he continued to receive information for months afterwards. And the 1769 tour is hilarious because it starts off as a really good piece of travel writing. And then every edition, it just gets fatter and fatter and fatter because more and more people are writing to him to say, oh, you forgot that cromlech, or please, could you give an account of my favourite antiquity in my village? And so more and more information is stuffed into the book with each successive edition. The texts thus absorb and represent the voices of his correspondents, as well as material from later research. So, if you're using a tour narrative as historical witness, it helps to know as much as possible about what lies behind the published account and which edition. Who is speaking here? The collaborative nature of Pennant's work was the major reason for the much warmer reception he received than did Samuel Johnson, who travelled in Scotland a year later. Ffion Jones's work on Pennant's Welsh networks is, I think, breaking new ground here for Wales as well, allowing us to assess much more accurately to what extent the tours in Wales can be said to voice Welsh culture and a Welsh perspective for an English-speaking audience. And so I think it's interesting to think about these texts as an act of cultural translation. Pennant is very fiercely proud of his Welshness and kind of bigs up its sort of opposition to other parts of the British Isles. You note here that actually the feeble Scots yielded more or less to the charms of luxury, whereas the Welsh did not. How, though, does Pennant how does he behave as a guide to North Wales? Well, as many a frustrated tourist points out, what he doesn't do is take you on a guided tour. The mechanics of getting from place to place come with later writers. In our exhibition selection, an example of the guidebook proper is best demonstrated by the indefatigable George Nicholson, who not only travels himself, but performs an extraordinary act of synthesis, pulling together key sections from various other writers and paying huge attention to practicalities. There's a lovely section on blisters, where he describes the need for soft, pliant shoes and flannel socks. He also tells you how to deal with blisters, should you be so unfortunate as to acquire any. Let out the serum with a needle, he says, without breaking the skin. Bathe the part with equal quantities of vinegar and lukewarm water, and apply a thin liniment of wax and oil with a little sugar of lead. And what I hadn't realised until last week when I got to pick this book up and handle it was what ridiculously small print it's done in, because he's crammed so much information into a pocket-sized guide. Jolly handy, but you really do need your glasses. Yet Pennant does shape the way people see and approach Wales. In 1797, one of my favourite writers, the novelist Catherine Hutton, sets off from Carnarvon with Pennant's description of the road as far as Snowdon in my pocket as well as my head. For, fearful of missing the grand object of my research, I transcribed it before I left home. This is really unusual, to hear how people used books, how people took them out into the landscape. She's gone to the trouble not only of memorising huge chunks of Pennant, but of writing bits out and then riding along in his footsteps, whatever you call them, to experience it with him, as it were. He leads her terribly astray, and she's awfully fed up because she kind of misses the great sight of Snowdon she was hoping to see, but that's another story. He is an admired author whose passage through a particular landscape has enhanced the experience of travel. Most tourists, though, just tend to excavate the tours for information at particular historical sites or viewpoints. As Lady Frances Crewe put it in 1795, I think, he bestows all his tediousness upon your worship, it's a quote from Shakespeare, but certain upon the spot, this makes him very satisfactory. So you send the servant back to your coach, get your pennant, and then somebody reads out everything you want to know about this particular castle. The bulkiness of Pennant's tours and the fact that they were not really designed as a guidebook was William Bingley's motivation for publishing the tour he made in the summer of 1798. Though Pennant, he says, is well calculated both to instruct and amuse in the closet. I've been thinking about that. Where does he mean? I never thought of Pennant as toilet reading as such, but I assume he means his study. The volumes are too long and uninteresting for the generality of persons when upon their journey. And he kind of has a point. So Bingley's two slim volumes, which were later expanded and conflated, mention Pennant's name over 130 times, sometimes critically, taking issue with interpretation of historical events, but very often with admiration. And at the top of Snowdon, this man, who is a great climber and a wonderful describer of mountains, simply reaches for Pennant, allowing, this never fails to astonish me, allowing him to voice the entire experience of something that must have really been quite important to him over, I think it's 8 pages of uninterrupted citation. There is no Bingley for the next 8 pages. It's all Pennant. He stands in for Bingley, and yet Bingley is a fine describer of mountains. So that tells you something about the status of Pennant's descriptions, I think. Elsewhere in the tour, he slips into Pennant's voice, often without realizing it or acknowledging him, and he is absolutely not alone here. Forgive me, everybody online who has seen this slide 10 million times already. It's a good one. I like to use it. This is Holywell, the Well of St. Winifred, which is described beautifully by Pennant as boiling with vast impetuosity out of a rock. Nobody can resist that, and they all reuse it unconsciously. They say it comes out with profusion and impetuosity, incredible impetuosity, vast impetuosity, and so on and so forth. That's the extent to which Pennant's tours sort of permeate the written word and the way of seeing of people who came after him. Pennant's accounts of Welsh history in the landscape also fed the creative historical imaginations of, just to name one or two, J.M.W. Turner. You can see in his notebooks that he's reading Pennant and picking up on the stories. The poets, Anna Seward and William Wordsworth. Wordsworth's Ascent of Snowdon is very much in the footsteps of Pennant. Novelist Thomas Love Peacock, many, many more. He was extremely widely read. And his work just doesn't have that kind of recognition today. And I think there are lots of reasons for this. One, I think, is that his sort of Welshness, his status as a Welsh writer, is very slippery. He's less visible in the field of Welsh and Celtic studies than, for example, his Welsh-speaking contemporaries, the Morris brothers. His social class, I think, has made him less amenable to the 20th century historical focus in Wales on energetic artisan class intelligentsia, Iolo Morgannwg, Thomas Glyn Cothi. Pennant is not of the right kind of class to be interesting to many 20th century historians, understandably, I think, and yet he's actually a very even-handed man politically. The more I read of Pennant, the less I think of him as fitting any kind of category. Also, travel writing itself rarely acquires the status of literature proper, so the genre as a whole has tended to slip through the cracks of the academic syllabus. But more practically, I think it's just that we lack available or accessible recent editions. Paul Evans did a really useful facsimile edition of the 1784 2-volume tour, but it's not widely available. There's no critical edition of this foundational text. With increasing access to Pennant's private correspondence, it's becoming easier for us to understand the complex, compilatory nature of Pennant's public productions. Sorry, I didn't mean to have quite so many P's in that sentence. To unpick the strands of local information and to get closer to and appreciate his stylistic voice, because he does a wonderful job of pulling these things together. He has a lovely prose style. We think that one way of doing this would be to create a digital edition. Again, I see the librarians blanch before me because we're talking about not real books, not real leather bindings, but something that could allow you to see the process of a tour being created from this beautiful, almost unique notebook of the North Wales tour, just a few jotted notes with plants that he actually picked up himself. And to find that in the National Library and open those pages and see those plants and know that he put them in there is really quite something. Then you can see how these jotted notes become the beautiful 2-volume tours, and ultimately the super deluxe coffee table version that he had hand illustrated by his artist Moses Griffith, of which there are several copies, but the National Library of Wales has digitised every single page of this beauty, so you can turn the pages and look at this. But imagine then a critical edition of Pennant that allowed you to access everything from the beginning to the end, with the letters, the voices, the sources and the images just a click away each time. And that's kind of what we're aiming at if we can get a little bit more funding in. So all you rich millionaires out there, please get in touch. I move now to the second part of my talk. I was going to say my talk, and I'm just going to glance because we have quite, we don't have a lot of time. Some of the personalities behind these other books, and I'd begin appropriately with the nice fact that Pennant himself becomes a character in other people's tours, and his home at Downing becomes a dot on their itinerary. Recalling his summer visit to the family of his college friend Robert Jones Llancanhafar, many decades after the event, the poet William Wordsworth remembered spending several agreeable hours in the library at Downing, described his host Pennant as a handsome figure of a man in the freshness of green old age. Just a few years later, an acquaintance of Wordsworth's, the Reverend Richard Warner, was also a visitor. He found Pennant rather frailer, but was equally overwhelmed at actually being there in Downing with him. Warner was then based in Bristol. He's an interesting man. He did 2 tours made over successive summers in 97 and 98. They're notable for the distances covered on foot, 25 to 30 miles a day usually, and for their lively interest in industrial sites as well as antiquities. Warner was part of a Bristol circle of writers, publishers and various others with liberal political beliefs. And although his tour, intended for the market, rather plays down his sympathies, he was certainly one of those people who saw in the principles of the French Revolution a new dawn for democracy and human rights. So it may not just be stylistic reasons which make him the particular bugbear of the young, conservative, Cambridge-educated clergyman, William Bingley, who goes out of his way to correct Warner's most egregious mistakes. His average rate of walking about 25 miles a day seems to have rendered him liable to 1,000 errors. He muddles his bangles up, which many people do, and it's completely unforgivable, of course. But the best of these is Bingley's outraged response to Warner's assertion that it is really not a good idea to drink spirits on the summit of Snowdon. Okay, so Warner says, don't do it, guys. Powerful liquor is more productive of danger than of comfort. A very small quantity in these ethereal regions was sufficient to intoxicate. And I mention this circumstance as a caution to you, should you visit these aerial heights. Well, Bingley's having none of it. A small quantity of spirits, he says, will also be found useful, as they're not only more pleasant in these cold alpine regions, but much more portable than tea, for example. He then says, it is incumbent on me to inform this tourist that he has very much mistaken the fact We always took along with us a pint of brandy, the whole of which we used to drink without experiencing the least of intoxication. And then again, a whole bottle of rum, we finished it without being the least the worse for it. These two guys are clergymen of the Church of England. I'd just like to point this out. So there you go, the battle of the spirits. The assiduous tracking down of the guide, he goes to the bother of looking for the guide who took Warner up the mountain in order to ask him if he really did tell him that spirits were really bad for you. And he just writes it all out over pages and pages and pages. Please just let it go. Anyway, Bingley likes to be informed, not just by books, but by people on the ground. His closest friend in Wales and informant was the Reverend Peter Bailey-Williams, the author of another one of the books selected for exhibition, which I won't have any time to talk about, unfortunately. It's a really interesting book, A Guide to Carnarvonshire. These two guys together scaled Clogwyndir Arde, and Bingley wrote up the experience in what is generally recognised as the first account of a proper climb in British literature. Well, like, you know, from then on, it's only a short step to that cafe in Llanberis with all the climbers and the rest of it. He hiked him up by his belt, apparently. Bingley's other Welsh collaborators are acknowledged in his introduction, and there's some really interesting people here. So we're not actually talking about an English tourist coming in from Cambridge knowing better than anybody else. He spends time, he talks to people. He's got people like John Wynne Griffith, an eminent botanist, Hugh Davis again, our naturalist from Anglesey, Mr. David Thomas of Redwarth, Beaumaris is Dafydd Eryri, one of the great Welsh poets of the period. So it kind of makes you think a little bit about dualities and critiques. Travel writing is often studied for very good reasons through a post-colonial framework, which explores the relations between the traveller, who controls the narrative of the journey, and the cultures described, who do not. And there is often a language difference between the describer and the described. As Howell Davis showed many years ago, Welsh tours can be fruitfully discussed through this lens. And there were at the time several Welsh writers offering their own critiques of the superficiality and general wrong-headedness of descriptions of Wales, produced by what Theophilus Jones calls the mosquito English tourists. They come in, they suck a little blood, and that nourishes them to go off and publish another Welsh tour. This guy, William Williams of Llandegai, wrote Observations on the Snowdon Mountains, and it's a kind of attempt to write back, at least in part. It was originally written for Lord Penrhyn, and this is his quarrymaster, William Williams. And he's pretty sharp on the failings of many tour writers, pointing out that their exaggerations, their romanticism, and the way they caricature the Welsh culture. And for Williams, language is the key issue. He's perceptive in understanding that it's often a case of misunderstanding on both sides. It may be that travellers are too apt to abuse the Welsh because they cannot or will not speak English, but their ignorance ought not to incur disgust. Their reluctance proceeds not from stubbornness, but from diffidence or fear of ridicule. Of all the tour books in this exhibition, the one that makes the most of the linguistic divide is probably Edward Pugh's delicious Cambria Depicta. It is just a brilliant book. Its Latin title neatly avoids the English-Welsh problem as well. It comes out of the artist's own expeditions in North Wales in the 1800s. The book was completed in 1813. It was published posthumously. He died before it came out. He was a Welsh speaker from Rhuthun. He's excellent company, good writer, excellent artist, and a thoroughly engaging traveller. He manages to feel wonderfully original while also being massively indebted to Thomas Pennant, who he absorbs wholesale in places, a bit like a boa constrictor. In the early 1800s, in a market totally swamped by written and visual picturesque tours of Wales, Pugh's own shtick is his ability to reach the parts that no other artists can reach. And he wants them to expand their geographic range. People are scared to go off the beaten track because they don't speak the language. And this was just my shoehorning in of the picturesque description of North Wales as an example, perhaps, of the kind of standard artist's tour of Wales, which just takes in the particular beauty spots that are fairly well known. Quite an interesting book, though, and we don't know who, I don't think we know who the artist was. Pennant Pugh, situates himself as a native artist, which allows him to act as both guide and critic, but best of all, it allows him to capture conversations with people of all classes. And it must be said that he has a lot of fun, mainly thanks to a truly wicked habit of pretending to be an English tourist in order to see what type of reaction he'll get, and then he can assess the natural generosity of his fellow countrymen accordingly. So in Llanllywni, with all his artist's gear, he is of course assumed to be a French spy, lurking about the mountains, making maps of the country, etc. And he's only given very reluctant admission to the pub, where his requests for food in English go completely unanswered. So he sits quietly, listening to everybody in this huge debate that's going on around him. The general opinion was rather unfavourable to me, principally on account of my portfolio. It's all his gear. I suddenly turned round and replied with some severity in their own language. It was not a little laughable to see the alteration in the people's looks at this moment. Like, okay, I'm not sure how kind of PC this is really. Then even worse, well, not worse, but it's a really weird episode. On the road to Llanymawddwy, he falls into step with an old woman who, first of all, laughs at him, and he does look daft. He's soaking wet. And as he said, his nether regions are entirely covered in mud because he's just been stomping through a bog. However, he pretends to be English and asks her in a very posh voice, "How do I get to Llanymawddwy?" She appeared greatly distressed that she was not able to understand me, and looked about her to see if there was anyone near who could answer my question at the same time, repeating in her own vernacular tongue, "Gwyn fy myd, pe bai rhywun yma a fedrai roddi'r gŵr da hysbysiad am yr hyn mae efo ei moddyn." I wish to heaven there was someone near who could answer this dear man and give him the information he wants. And this, says Pugh rather smugly, is one of the many instances I have met on this journey disproving the assertions of English tourists who represent the character of the Welsh to be morose and uncivil. Whenever such appearances occur, we may candidly conclude that it arises from their ignorance of the language. Okay. The ignorance of the language, we may note here, refers, of course, to Welsh ignorance of the English language, not the other way around. Many tour writers go out of their way in this period to explain the phonetics of Welsh and to give basic vocabulary, and even to praise Welsh for sounding a little bit like Italian. But there is never at this period any sense that learning English might threaten Welsh. The sociolinguistic dynamics are really not quite as we might see them today, because Welsh, 90% of the populace at this period is Welsh speaking. So there's no sense of it being something fragile. I'm going to move on now to my third and final theme of unheard voices. Two books in the exhibition lead us into this subject. The first is Richard Duppa's 1816 edition of Samuel Johnson's rather desultory tour of Wales from 1774. This is a posthumous edition of a text which Johnson had no intention of publishing. After the life-changing tour of Scotland, and in spite of his intelligent interest in the Welsh language, he felt that in Wales there was nothing to see. It is interesting to us because, as with correspondence, it allows us to see him a little more privately. And we can note here that Duppa was himself quite reticent, sparing us details of the doctor's digestive problems, which only a more recent edition of the manuscript could face. And one can only pity the poor travellers who ended up sharing a room with Dr. Johnson in a very mean inn in Bangor. I lay in a room where the other bed had two men. I had a flatulent night. That didn't get into the 1816 edition. Johnson travelled with his friend Hester Piozzi, whose diary provides a rather anxious counterpoint to Johnson's. And here I think a second book is relevant. Louisa Costello's Falls, Lakes and Mountains of North Wales, 1845, is I think the most recent book in the selection. It comes from a rather different era of writing. It's lavishly illustrated by the author and lavishly overwritten in a very 1840s style. And I am going to claim sanctuary in my pre-1825 cutoff point. I rarely venture beyond 1830, mainly because everybody sounds like this. I just want to share with you the touching thought with which Miss Costello actually begins her work. It would seem as if that part of the country called the Principality had been created by nature in a holiday humour, expressly for the recreation and delight of English tourists, whose limited time did not allow them to seek for beauties abroad. Nice. But this is actually the only book in the exhibition by a woman, and that is significant. And for much of the period that I've been discussing, women's voices go unheard. And yet they are here in the many manuscript tours which never made it into print. This is Michael Freeman's wonderful data. You can see here that for the period I'm mostly interested in, 90s and 1800s, lots of things get published. 47, 48, that's quite a good outcome in terms of publications. 106 and 125 non-published manuscript tours that have survived to us and that we know about. So we're looking at big numbers here. Our mission with the Curious Travellers has been to get more of these texts published. They are every bit as alive and often a lot more insightful than those of their male counterparts. I'd like to pay tribute here to the work of Liz Edwards and Alex Deans, and to our PhD student Kirsty McHugh, who single-handedly, she transcribed the coded scribbles of Anne Lister on her North Wales tour. And if you want what literary criticism currently calls embodied experiences, then you should try Anne Lister, aka Gentleman Jack, sharing a hotel room with her aunt and trying to find a private space to check the discharge in her underwear after catching venereal disease from her lover, Marianne, in Chester, who herself has been infected by a complete bastard of a husband who refuses to die. They were kind of hoping that he would sort of quietly just get out of the way. And so she's actually in a right state on this Welsh tour. She's not well. She's having a really bad relationship time. And then her and her aunt climb Snowdonia shortly afterwards, and they totally eat off all the male competition. It's just brilliant. It's very, very, very funny. Well, funny, but also very moving tour. There are many other voices on our website, which I leave you to discover. But I want to finish my talk with one of my favourites, again, Catherine Hutton, who travelled from Birmingham with her father and spent several weeks over successive years exploring North Wales from Caernarfon. And I'm going to home in on just a single moment in August 1799, the summer, if you remember, after the Irish uprising, which was brutally squashed by the British, including many Welsh militia who went across. There were atrocities performed by Welsh militia in 1798, in the summer of 1798 in Ireland against Irish rebels. And of course, a huge amount of upheaval and a lot of coming and going. This reminds us then that this is the period when Britain is still enmeshed in the Revolutionary Wars, and takes us back to the point of Wales as a safe, maybe benign alternative to a war-torn continent. But I'd like to use it as an example of why, in most travel writing, Wales is not actually just a playground created by the Almighty for leisured English tourists. It's a space where meaning is created by chance encounters, poignant and ironic juxtapositions. The Huttons were part of a largely dissenting liberal circle, which included Joseph Priestley. And when Priestley's library and laboratory were burned down by a loyalist mob in 1791 or 2, the Huttons' house was also burned down. So bear that in mind as we explore her work. They began travelling in North Wales in the mid-1790s. And in 1799, we find them in rooms in a guest house in Caernarfon, staying there for about a month. In a letter to her brother, Catherine offers a brief vignette. It's a self-portrait, very rare moment thinking about herself. This morning I've been dusting the furniture of my chamber, putting all things in order. I might, it is true, have called up the housemaid and desired her to be the operator, but beside that Welsh ideas of cleanliness do not accord with mine, I thought it less trouble to do it myself. My employment brought to mind Madame Roulon in the prison of the Abbé. I resemble her in my taste for neatness, books and flowers. And though I am more weak and timid, I might perhaps resemble her in resolution if a great occasion called it forth. But that occasion would have no connection with politics. I have several loves stronger than the love of my country. The swerve in direction halfway through this paragraph is extraordinary. Putting all things in order is one of the pleasures afforded the more than overnight visitor. I'm sure we've all done it. You unpack, you settle in, you pretend you make a play home in your week or fortnight away. Hutton is making a temporary home in a smaller, less complex space. And there's an imaginative element at play here. What if these rooms really were my home? And even that passing jibe at Welsh cleanliness, which is a leitmotif across the genre, supports the image of a woman who does things for herself, who controls her own space. And this scene of peaceful absorption concludes an account of the previous day's grueling journey from Conway, much of it on foot in torrential high wind and rain. The storm was devastating. It was the one that swept away all the bridges. So it was an extreme weather event, uncontrollable and frightening, disrupting travel and patterns of normal life. Why then does Hutton think of Manon Roland? An influential figure in the early years of the French Revolution, Roland was a member of the Girondin faction, and she was executed during the Terror. She was arrested in June 1793 and spent a month in the prison at the Abbé Saint-Germain, where she was allowed to receive visitors and had access to books and a piano. She was then moved to harsher conditions at Saint-Pélagie and guillotined in November. Her memoir, Appel à l'impartiale postérité, an appeal to impartial posterity, was completed in October 1793, smuggled out of prison and published in 95. And I think Hutton has in mind here Roland's striking description of her first attempts at improving her new surroundings in the Abbé. I rose early and employed myself about my household affairs, that is to say, making my bed, cleaning my little place, rendering it and myself as neat as I could. Had I desired these things to be done for me, I know they would not have been refused, but I was aware that I must have paid for them dearly, waited a long time, and had them very superficially done at last. Roland explains at several points how her focus on order and routine, her pleasure in reading, in sketching and music, becomes a form of quiet but wholly deliberate resistance to those who wish to destroy her. The temporary domestic space of the guest room in Carnarvon thus reverberates with a presence both tragic and inspirational. And this is intensified by Hutton's introduction to another resident. I've made another acquaintance directly opposite. Pity for her forlorn situation attaches one to her. She's an unmarried woman turned of 30, of noble family in Ireland, whom the troubles have driven into Wales. She's not been in any personal danger, but her brother's house has been plundered by the rebels, his domestics threatened with instant death. She's in such is her terror at these proceedings, she declared to me she would not have slept another night in his house. She sleeps in her clothes. She's at Carnarvon without either friend or servant. The people here have a notion she's a little deranged. This, however, is not the case. She appears to me not only rational, but sensible. She's so grateful for my attention. Her manner is so affecting that sometimes I can hardly refrain from tears. Hutton says nothing further about this woman. She's just one of many briefly but vividly evoked characters in her tours. But the story intersects with Hutton's own experience of violence at home, the imagined presence of Manon Roland, and it demonstrates how journeys made for pleasure along the rapidly developing tourist routes of Wales are entangled with forced journeys caused by the wider repercussions of the French Revolution across Britain and Ireland. Reflecting on the marked increase and hurry of tourist traffic in the last 2 years, Hutton has no doubt of their mutual interaction. This hurry has been occasioned by the perpetual intercourse between the two kingdoms of Britain and Ireland during the Troubles in Ireland. As Claire Connolly has observed, to track such perspectives is to move with history itself, as crossing the Irish Sea becomes a necessary, even routine aspect of colonial modernity. Being an unusually perceptive traveller, Hutton is also aware of how tourism itself is beginning to impact on the lives and homes of local people in Wales. To conclude, many of the tours we study produce similar snagging moments. You pull a little bit at a thread and suddenly find yourself connected to large and complex issues, from a copper mine in Anglesey to the global slave trade, from the weird, clear, green, fishless lakes on Snowdon to the environmental crisis we all face today, from nicely bound coffee table tomes by gentlemen tourists to the secret diaries of a lesbian landowner, from castles and cromlechs to traumatized refugees. Romantic era picturesque tourism can be amusing, frivolous, pretty and pleasurable, but it can also be challenging, thoughtful and occasionally unsettling. It is, after all, the beginning of the tourist industry which largely sustains this country today, and all the seeds of its benefits and of its bitter injustices are already there. If the subject interests you, then come and talk to us. Write blogs for us, transcribe for us, and research with us. There's plenty of room in the Curious Traveller's coach for everybody. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you so much for what was an incredibly enjoyable and informative talk, I think we all agree. And I feel really inspired. I actually want to come and do something
Great.
For you.
You're on board.
I think what amazed me was just the sheer number of accounts that there are. I had no idea about that.
It's like a, the tip of the iceberg is what you have in the library, and then so many people coming in, so many records, some scrappy, some just letters, some diaries, some beautifully written, illustrated, and not really known about. So, great resource, it really is.
Does anyone here have a question?
Hi, diolch yn fawr iawn, Marianne. I really enjoyed that talk. You mentioned that the fragility or the socio-linguistic situation of Welsh, and that the fragility of the language was not really, it wasn't really encountered by the travellers, or that it, in terms of percentages of speakers and so on, especially in the sort of lower middle classes and in the working classes at that period, the percentage would have been quite substantial anyway, and it would have been the language of most places that the tourists visited. Is there any indication of any linguistic change happening in the journals and in the books that you've encountered?
I think there is, and it's something that I'm looking into a bit more closely at the moment, because I thought I'd just go through and see how people describe Welsh, where they describe it, and what their responses are to it. And again, whether it's a kind of imaginary Welsh that they're talking about, because actual hard facts are very hard to come by. What you get, of course, is a growing body of innkeepers who have actually come in from England to service the English tourist trade on the main roads. So on the Anglo-Irish road and on the roads as they're built then through the mountains. And as the tourist trade increases, you need increasing numbers of people who are able to work between the two cultures and to take you to a waterfall, to help you find the horses you need. And as Michael Freeman has pointed out, there are quite a lot of jobs for young women in this, that kind of bright young women are being recruited to help out in the inns and various other tourist the bathing places as well. And you start to see a lot more interaction between the languages at that point, and it starts to come onto the radar more, I suppose, with English things. But in general, there's this sense, a lot of the writers talk about the language as if it were the mountains, as if it is somehow the bulwark against, not particularly English, but against modernity, against all that is frivolous and wrong and not of the soil and of the place. And in fact, it's the English tourists who don't particularly like the changes, because obviously an awful lot of Welsh families are making a very good living out of taking people up Snowdon and providing food. It plays havoc with prices as much as language, so that people are massively overpaying for a meal in an inn compared to what the economy would have been 5 years earlier. You get all sorts of strange things happening with the economics of it. But what you almost, it's just too, it's before the beginnings of the big sort of moments that break into the monolith of Welsh speaking. I think it's still about 90% at this period. I think what's really interesting is Edward Pugh from Rhuthun on the other side, coming over to the Llŷn Peninsula and just having fun with these people. It's a little bit, if an English tourist had done that, you would be really cross. It's kind of, there's something quite interestingly in between about Pugh, I think. He's a fascinating character. Look into him more.
I do have a question online. Now I have to take my glasses off to read it. Do you know of any travel writers to Mid Wales, e.g. to Thomas Jones at Pencerrig, to Hafod, etc.?
Yes, I do.
Excellent.
And in fact, I'm struggling to write a chapter about Hafod at the moment. Again, I can only send you back to Michael Freeman's amazing website, plug in Hafod, and you will get a list of all the people who visited Hafod at the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century and beyond. You can sort them out for yourselves. Picking through that mass, the one that I've decided to focus on is actually Richard Warner, whose account of the Ystwyth Valley, the lead mines, and then Johns's estate is extraordinary. And I'm trying to do, it was again one of those snagging moments for me, which once I started to follow it, led into a chapter growing out of it. The contrast between the sterility of the landscape around the lead mines, which are literally killing everything, and then pineapple houses and the rest of it in Johns's estate, and Johns's genuine attempts to create not a kind of frivolous paradise, but a genuine working agricultural space. He's a farmer as well as a connoisseur and a visionary and all the other things. There's an awful lot more to be done on Hafod. It's been done a lot, but there are still letters that haven't been published, and there's lots more you could do with it. It's an incredible story, Hafod. So yes, lots of people go there.
Fantastic. Well, I hope that answers the question to our online questioner. Any more questions in the room? Or online, indeed?
Yes. So it's slightly ill-formed, but I didn't want you to. It seemed like it wasn't such a really interesting discussion that elicits conversation. I noted that in passing you said that there's been attempts to sort of apply post-colonial critiques to the tours of Wales. Could I just invite you to say a little bit more about that and how they are viable or they don't work, how the post-colonial perspective doesn't work? And I suppose you've answered that a little bit by talking about Wales as in-between status, but just through my own interest, an invitation to speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think, again, this is something that would benefit from a lot more thought. But Howell Davis did a really good article many years ago thinking about that sort of dialectic of the incomer describing. And then it was at the period when there was an increasing interest in post-colonial studies about people writing back. And so he basically focuses on the fantastic kind of hatchet job done by Theophilus Jones on tour writers. And it's a very subtle reading, I think, because what it does is it shows that very often the Welsh writers writing back and saying it's not like this and it's not like this and it's really not like this and how dare you think we're like this, are overplaying their hand somewhat and trying to claim a greater respectability for Welsh than is actually the case. So the example that Davis uses is Theophilus Jones says, this guy says we all believe in fairies. Can you believe it? Do you think people at the end of the 18th century believe in fairies? Nonsense. Davies points out that just in the next valley, we've got Edmund Jones writing about fairies and ghosts and collecting this material in a genuine scientific attempt to catalogue the supernatural. So, and it's like Jones is just saying, this is nothing to do with me. This is the Wales you need to know about. So there's always a kind of partiality, and once you dig deep, then the binary them and us just almost never works, because it's a lot to do with who you know, who you've talked to, what your own affiliations are. And Methodism is another one that gets everybody split in different directions. But I think you could take almost any tour and apply those kind of frameworks to it, but subtly beating them down away from a simple binary, definitely, yeah.
We have some more
Oops,
questions.
on the back there.
Yeah, I was interested to think by what you said about the landscape being a place for the creation of meaning, and in the interaction of all this happenstancey interaction of people. I suppose the conflict between different languages as well going on that seem monotheistic, can't say the word, one big thing. Whereas they're really kind of changing anyway.
Brilliant, yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to do at the minute. Another thing that people who write about travel writing does lend itself to sort of structural analyses, and a lot of the criticism I've written is also quite kind of class-based, and says, so you see the English middle classes coming in and misreading the Welsh lower classes, etc., etc., and these are their misconceptions, and this is why they've done it. And they always seem to be the kind of agents of this perception of landscape. They're writing the narrative, they're in control. Nigel Lees pointed out many years ago that actually an awful lot of these people are not really in control once you start reading what's happening to them. There's a classic account by a critic of one of the English explorers arriving at Lake Tanganyika and kind of gazing down on this domain. And Nigel points out that the guy's actually blind by the time he gets there, so that the tourist gaze has been severely impaired and impacted by his bruising encounter with reality. And I'm really interested in happenstance, in accident, in the unexpected, and the way it throws people off their desired course. A lot of these people do their homework before they come in. They say, I'm going to visit this, I'm going to visit this, I'm going to visit this. But tourism is not seamless, and tourism is, as we all know, your flight is cancelled, the stewardess gets COVID, things happen. And I'm really interested in the moments on tours where things happen that upset that kind of jog along sense of, I'm coming in to see your country, I'm going to describe it and get out again. Lots of things happen to them en route. So yeah, really good question.
I have 3 questions.
Okay.
So we'll maybe wrap it up after the third. One is quite quick. Are there any accounts that refer to cycling or boating as a means of exploration or travel?
Oh, cycling, I have no idea. I think that is way into my... I told you I do not go beyond the 1840s for very good reasons. Boating, however, what you need to read is the amazing Voyage Around the Coast of Great Britain by Richard Ayton and William Daniel, a writer and an artist. They call it sailing on horseback because half the time their boats can't actually operate because of the weather. William Daniel produces a series of beautiful lithographs of, they're going up the coast of Wales in 1813. They have all kinds of adventures on the way. They are a rare example of tourists describing the land from the sea, like that beautiful novel that came out a few years ago. And the account of arriving in Aberystwyth in the dark, in a really choppy sea, in a very little boat with people who clearly didn't know what they were doing, and the jagged rocks around them. And it's like the beginning of The Tempest. It's an amazing piece of writing. Their coastal descriptions are just superb. They're fantastic, and they are people who are always finding that every day their plans are derailed, and I think that's what I like about them. So yes, coastal literature can do, but not many people do it.
I'll ask you a quick question, and then there's one or two more. Do we know where the painting shown on the screen has been taken from?
Yes, we do. That's Moses Griffith, the amazing Moses Griffith, Pennant's servant artist, as he called him. But again, I think the relationship was much more interesting than that. These illustrations were added to the beautiful, huge coffee table versions, and they're all online in the National Library of Wales. The National Library of Wales has released every single one of these images on Wikimedia Commons for you to do anything you like with. They're free, they are beautiful quality stuff. The number of posters and lectures we've done with these, I cannot tell you, but again, go to Tours in Wales on Wikimedia Commons and look for Thomas Pennant's Tours in Wales. All those images will be downloaded for you. You can explore so much fantastic stuff. So yeah, that's Griffith.
Can I ask you one more?
Yeah.
How influential was the landscape artist Richard Wilson in bringing travellers to his native Wales?
He was influential, but again, we have to think a little bit about access at this point. Richard Wilson is quite early, so working in the sort of 50s and 60s. His paintings, which are just beautiful, and there was a wonderful exhibition in Cardiff in the National Museum at the beginning of our project, which we were able to kind of join in on, are stunning. But they're not widely accessible except to very elite sort of gentry classes of the people who had them hanging on their walls. And this is where Pennant kicks in again, because what Pennant's tours did was make prints, and then so people had views that they couldn't otherwise have seen because they were hanging on rich people's walls, basically. So Wilson is hugely influential in the way, in shaping people's desire to go to Wales. He paints it as if it's Italy, and the light is always that amazing yellow light. The characters are always desperately beautiful. It's beautiful stuff. But for example, his picture of Llyn Cai, the very famous one of Llyn Cai on Cadair Idris, which you may know, extraordinary painting, makes it look a bit like Vesuvius, a crater. That is reproduced by Pennant as well. So the pictures do get out there, and they do shape, and they certainly influence gentry who want to come and look at these mountains, and they're the first people in, I suppose, with the means and leisure to do so. So if you go to the Curious Travellers website, there's a contact page. If you want to write anything, if you've walked somewhere, if you've got questions or pictures or notebooks in your attic, then please get in touch, and we would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That has been really, really stimulating and enjoyable, and it has certainly made me want to go and look at some of these places now and see if they actually look like that. Thank you for your time, and it's been fantastic.
Diolch yn fawr. Diolch.